Hello, and welcome to Freelancing for Journalists.
I'm Lily Cantor.
And I'm Emma Wilkinson.
Welcome to the final series of the year, which is all about specialisms. We're going to be digging into the world of niche journalism to find out exactly how it works. But first, as always, we're going to do our win of the week. So Emma, come on, hit me with it. What is your win of the week?
Okay, so you and I have a big project that we're working on at the moment that's proving quite hard to find time to work on that big project because we're working on, full time and everything else. But it's quite an important project. So I've been keeping a running tally this month of everything that I've and everything that I've got sort of booked in. And as of yesterday, I hit what I needed to hit to pay the bills this month, which means that I've taken next week off. Well, not off. I've cleared next week's schedule so that I can concentrate on the project. So that felt quite nice because it was kind of sort of looming in the back of my mind that I really needed to find time, to find some spare time. And it's just really hard, isn't it, to juggle that, needing the income but finding the headspace to do something else. So I feel quite good now that next week is sorted and I'm going to have some thinking space.
Yeah.
What's yours, Lily?
Yeah. Well, mine's sort of similar actually, in that this month I've agreed to do a load of shifts, and it's just been quite nice because it means I can kind of switch off from pitching. And I know I've got this work coming through, but on the days when I haven't got shifts, similarly, I'm working on our project, and I worked it out that, the shifts were enough to cover what I needed this month, and then the rest could go on the project, which one day we'll be able to reveal. But I guess it's tricky when you're working on something where you're not getting paid at the moment, but further down the line you will get paid, and it there will be other things that come out of it, but it's that constant juggle. But yeah, for me it's just been taking on shift work, and again, clearing my mind. I don't actually have to think other than turn up on the day and do what I need to do. So that's been nice, but I certainly couldn't do it every month. It's not necessarily the way I like to work all the time, but it's nice to just do it every now and then.
Yeah, I mean, it just shows, doesn't it, how you have to constantly readjust your needs and what the kind of things that you're working on, depending on what else you've got on your plate. Okay, it's time to introduce our guest for this episode. Very exciting. Today, we have with us Charlotte Vowden, who is a freelance writer and presenter whose specialist subject is cars, particularly classic cars. Before being freelance, Charlotte spent more than 15 years as a national newspaper journalist and editor. And this is such an unusual niche, and she does a few other things as well, which we're going to learn about. We can't wait to hear more about how she got into it.
Yeah, so hi, Charlotte. It's really good to have you here today. First of all, though, we want to find out a bit more about you. Emma's given us a bit of an introduction there, but can you tell us a bit more about your career so far, and how did you end up kind of focusing on this particular niche?
Yeah. Well, hello to both of you and everyone that's listening. It's an absolute privilege to appear as a guest on the podcast. So thank you for the invitation. And I suppose a sort of potted history of my career so far. So I have both of my granddads to thank for where I am today professionally and also personally. So I had a really tough time when I was at school. I was a lot bigger than I am now, and I was bullied a lot. And my gramps, which was my dad's dad, used to pick me up from school in his Ford Escort, and we'd sit in the car, and I'd cry my eyes out, and he'd say, "Do you know what, girl? One day you're going to show them how it's done, my darling." And I've actually got the initials of that phrase tattooed on my right wrist, which is my writing hand. And he also said to me, "You're going to get a column in the Times. You're going to do it." I'm from a farming background. My dad's a mechanic by trade. We didn't know anyone in that profession or that world. But those words of encouragement from my gramps, you're going to do it, you're going to get this column in the Times, is basically what became the catalyst for my career. I was a very creative child. I made loads of stuff, loved crafting, loved writing stories and poems and things like that. And I remember in primary school, the thrill of getting the local newspaper when my review of A Midsummer Night's Dream had been published. It was like the best moment ever. and my nan kept the newspaper cuttings. She kept all of the newspaper cuttings that she could get hold of when she was alive. And as I said, I was like a really studious child. I did well at school. I went on to sixth form, and then went to Essex University to study creative writing, because at that point I always had that sort of newspaper and journalism idea in my mind, but I sort of went down the creative writing route, got there and thought, it's going to be really tricky to make a living out of this. Not to say journalism is any easier, it's just different. And so I took it upon myself to go through actual physical print newspapers. You know, this was back in 2007. This was when Twitter was sort of in its infancy. This was before Instagram, TikTok, Facebook was still really early doors. And so getting hold of people and accessing people like editors was so much harder than it is now. And so I went through physical papers in the local library and got all the email addresses, you know, like letters at, or, you know, editor at, or whatever, inquiries. And I constructed an email, and it was a kind of a blanket email. So there was no personalization to it whatsoever. Sent it off, and I had one reply, and it was from an editor at the Times. And she told me to get a dictionary, because basically I'd misspelt the word career as career. So I'd sent this email out to all of these addresses saying I was really interested in a career in journalism. So that was lesson number one, is always proofread before you press send on that email. So I rewrote the email, sent it again, and I got a response from a man called William Hartston, who still writes for the Daily Express, and he invited me down to the London office for a cup of tea and some homemade biscuits and a chat. The chat went really well, and then from that point on, in my first and second and third year at uni, I travelled from Essex to London once a week to do some work experience with him. So he had a column, but then I started working across the desks. You know, as you do, you go into the environment and you just start talking to people, and, you know, just trying to get as many chances to write or help out or just learn how that newspaper works. And my first paid job was thanks to a lady called Caroline Jowett, and she ran the arts desk. So I did paperback book reviews, a roundup every week, which was pretty intense, on top of my degree, which is all about reading books every week, and also writing stories. But I really hustled. I really worked hard whilst I was studying. When I graduated, I moved back to North London, where I'm from, and commuted into London doing various different like work placements. But after the summer, it just got it was so expensive, and again, this was the days where if you were using a mobile phone, there weren't a lot of like unlimited calls contracts, and so every phone call I made out of hours cost me money, it cost my mum money on the landline, and it just got to the point where I couldn't physically afford to do it anymore. And I worked out in one magazine I'd done like six grand's worth of features for free, and you get to a point where you're just, it's make or break. And I got to that point. And I had a particularly difficult time at a certain magazine. I call it my Devil Wears Prada chapter, and it was through the grapevine. Someone at the Sunday Times had heard that I'd had a really tricky time, a lady called Jill Turner, and she rang me on a day I had a migraine. I answered the phone as I was recovering, and she said, "Do you fancy doing a trial shift at the Sunday Times?" And hallelujah, I was just like, fairly fresh out of uni, and I've been invited to do a trial shift at Sunday Times. And, going back to those conversations in my granddad's Ford Escort about, you're going to get a column in the Times, girl. I was like, could this be the beginning of that journey to getting that column? So of course I said yes. I went for my trial shift. I dressed in my mum's clothes because I didn't know what to expect. I thought it was going to be really corporate, really professional. So I was wearing this like tweed skirt, knee-high flat boots, a blazer, a really horrible coat. Sorry, mum. And I felt like an absolute impersonator, intruder, all of those things that people quite often talk about now, is that you feel like an imposter. That was totally me on the first day doing this trial shift. But it went really well. And I realized that actually you have the different tribes within a newspaper. The designers dress really differently to the news reporters, to the people on the arts desk. And so I kind of thought, okay, actually, I can actually just come in here and wear the clothes that I feel comfortable in and do the job that I'm doing. So that was good. And that started a decade-long sort of career at the Sunday Times. During that, I went and did my NCTJ in journalism, 6-month fast track, just to sort of foundation skills in like law and shorthand, which I never used, and public affairs and stuff like that. And I also did a 6-month stint at Mail Online for my sins. Found that really difficult, and actually turned down the one and only ever paid job, like contractually, that I ever got offered. I just it didn't sit well what I was being asked to do with how my journalism I feel that I want to be aligned with. So did 10 years at the Sunday Times, which was incredible. I worked across different desks, travel, arts, news. I was very much part of that digital transition where you went from the print product to having smartphone apps and the tablet edition, which was really exciting. And again, the use of social media in sharing those stories and retelling and repurposing the stories that we were doing. And then in 2019, they merged the Sunday Times and Sunday Times, so the redundancies began. I was part of that first wave, and I finished, I think it was the 2nd of December 2019. And for the first time in my professional career, and also my personal life as well, because the job was so consuming, it was everything to me. I did horrible shifts, and you miss out on so much when you do that kind of thing, that kind of job, as with many jobs. And I really struggled when I got made redundant. I had no purpose, but I had inherited my late grandfather's car, and this is my mum's dad. So this is when my other granddad comes into the story, is that he'd passed away in 2016. And he'd left this beautiful chariot red 1960 British sports car, which is an MGA Roadster, convertible, soft top, lots of chrome, beautiful car. And the car is called Frisky because the number plate is FSK 302. It was his cheeky little retirement present to himself. And so I'd already started writing for driving.co.uk, which is a branch of the Sunday Times, about my experiences with the car, with the scene, and just exploring, what it was all about. And so as I got made redundant, and then COVID hit, and being a freelancer during the pandemic and new to being a freelancer, also very difficult, but very privileged in that I was still living with my dad at the time. So I didn't have to worry about putting a roof over my head and food on my plate. I was very, very lucky because I'd moved back out of London by this point. And I just sat there feeling really sorry for myself for a while. And then I started using my granddad's classic car for volunteering during the pandemic. Just doing shopping and taking it to various places for elderly and vulnerable people. And I thought, I've got an opportunity here. I'm gonna go for it with this car. I'm gonna see what I can do with this car to change my career and give myself a niche. And that's what I did. And sort of 3 years later, 3 awards for classic car writing and a new TV series later, it's going okay. But as I say, both of these chapters of my career have been very much sort of begun by the influences of my granddads, and I feel really privileged about that. And then now I'm sort of all about classic cars and the countryside and things, and it's just such a huge subject. So that's the sort of, hopefully that made some sort of chronological sense, but that's how I kind of got to where I am today.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you made that conscious decision to kind of find yourself a niche, because we get asked this all the time from new freelancers, like, is it better to be a generalist? Is it better to kind of find your little area that you have specialist knowledge of? Especially because you'd worked across all those desks at the Sunday Times, so potentially you could have done anything. So was that kind of, talk us through that decision, like a very conscious, right, I'm going to try and set my stall out in this kind of area of journalism?
I think for me, because my work has always been such a big part of me personally, because particularly when you're writing, you're putting yourself out there, you're making yourself very vulnerable, and so a lot of my emotion is tied up in what I do for a living. And what this car represented was a connection to my late grandfather. And during that time where lots of people were feeling vulnerable in 2020, when the pandemic initially hit, and, you know, going from that point, is that it was for me, it was a way to reconnect to him, but also do something that might make him proud. And you know, having this classic car is such a privilege, and I wanted to do something really useful with that. So I feel like I was almost given that niche by him, and I think having a niche is really powerful, because it's really good to know the subject that you're talking about. It's also really good to live your subject as well, you know, and I live and breathe that car. I do stuff, you know, that isn't involved in work with it, but I also used it as a kind of a sort of catalyst for this next chapter. But it's also led to lots of other stuff that I hadn't expected. So, you know, I've got that niche, and I think being a female going into a very male dominated world and industry, that has helped me sort of, I think, propel myself further, because there aren't many voices like my own, particularly in journalism, within the classic car and automotive scene, that's really helped create a sort of my own platform within that niche as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, like what that's like being a woman in that scene, which I would imagine as well, is it an older generation as well that's involved in classic cars?
Yeah, the classic car scene is typically, you know, middle-aged white male. That is changing. I have done commissioned some research, and that does show there is a slight shift in the gender balance. But for me personally, I'm all about championing women within the industry, but also about, you know, sending the message that it needs to be a more diverse and inclusive place across the board. You know, it's not just about gender, it's about age, it's about backgrounds, it's about everything. And the industry at the moment just isn't there. And so going into it, I worked in newspapers. That was a very male dominated industry, and I feel like I got that thick skin when I worked there, and so I think I was prepared for it when I started working within the automotive space. But I have found it at times quite difficult, particularly at shows. I felt quite vulnerable. I have experienced, you know, sort of sexual discrimination, both physically and, you know, in verbal form. And it can be frightening. I had an instance at a car show where a man touched me in an inappropriate way, you know, and I didn't call him out on it. And it wasn't until 2 days later, when I was talking to my friend, I just burst into tears, and I got really angry with myself, because I should have said, you know, I'm not comfortable with how you're holding. He put his hand on my wrist and pulled me in, and it was just, it didn't make me feel good. And so I've had to learn lessons now, because a lot of what I do is out at shows, at events, when you're face to face with people. And, you know, generally is more male dominated. I've learned lessons myself, is to actually call people out on stuff and say, that's not okay, that's not appropriate. And that's, you know, that's in the way that people are approaching you as well, because I think one of the biggest things that women face within the scene is bias, whether that's unconscious or conscious. And so I've written pieces about my own experiences of it, other women's experiences of it. And people get angry about that, but it's not about shaming people, it's about illuminating a problem and trying to encourage people to rethink the way that they think now, so that it changes in the future. You know, it's not about cancelling people, it's I suppose calling people out, but not in an aggressive way. It's just trying to educate people that, you know, you can't say that, you can't think that, it's not okay. And so it has been quite challenging, but to a point. At the same time, that means that there's so much space to grow and do some good, and I have noticed it, you know, through what I do, is I champion those women who are already there doing what they do, but just by putting them on that platform and giving the opportunity to share with other people what they're doing, you know, that's really powerful and it's really positive. And things like International Women's Day, I've always found quite difficult, because, you know, as a freelancer, it's a hook to help pitch to an editor. You know, it's like, oh well, it'll be trending on social media, so we should do this, and you know, it's using that hook of International Women's Day, but also being really conscious of the fact that every day should be, you know, publishing stories about awesome females. It's not just one day. But to get that conversation started within the scene and with the industry, I've used International Women's Day to do that. So I was the first female columnist in a magazine called Practical Classics, which is the most read sort of practical classic car magazine in the UK. And as far as I'm aware, International Women's Day had never been spoken about before. And so I wrote a column about it. And from that is it's a starting point. And I think that's the thing. It's like, yep, you know, people have really strong opinions about things like that, but if you can use it as a starting point, then that's a really good thing, because then hopefully it becomes more normal. You know, it's normalizing it, and kind of going back to the whole diversity of the scene. I interviewed the boss of Ford UK, a woman called Lisa Brankin, and you know, she rarely gives interviews. So for me personally, it was a really cool get. I was like, yes, you know, she's agreed to talk to me. And she, you know, raised a really good point, is that she doesn't, you know, she's the first woman to take on this role. She's completely, you know, smashed it. She's worked at the company for decades, going from a graduate to literally the boss of Ford UK. And she said, yes, it's about, you know, encouraging more females into it, but it's also looking across her office. They hire from different sectors so that it's a more diverse space and there's different voices. It's not just about gender, it's about everybody. So I'm not sure if that I've gone off on tangents there, but yeah.
No, I mean, one thing that kind of struck me as you were talking there is that if you're coming into you know, an area with taking a different lens, because you've got a different perspective, you know, you're coming into very male dominated kind of field, but you're perhaps looking for more unusual stories, for kind of different groups within those stories. If you're kind of one of the arguments that's always made kind of against having a niche is that you can narrow yourself, you can limit yourself too much on the type of articles you write. But if you look at the articles that you've done, you've found so many kind of interesting stories, unusual stories within that world. So yeah, I wonder if that's because you've kind of come at it with a different perspective, maybe, that you've got an eye for looking for those stories.
Absolutely. I've just been a creative. You know, you look at the thing, the car itself is an object, but how does that car get put together? Who, you know, it's like, it's the story of that vehicle. It's like, if you're trying to encourage younger people into the automotive space, it's like, okay, look at the car. You could be the person that works out how to build that engine. You could be the person that shapes the bodywork. You could be the person that makes paint. You could be the person that photographs it. You could be the person that markets it. You could be the person that you know, does the trim work. You could be a person that writes about it. You could be the person that drives it. You could be the person that fixes it. The car itself, like anything, is just an object. But if you take a step back and look at all the amazing things that go on around that object and the people that are involved in that process, you know, the opportunities to tell stories are endless. And I think the scene is so stuck in its ways. You know, the stories they're telling, I find a lot of it really boring, because there's not a lot of human sort of input into it. And so one of the series that I launched was called Hard Craft, and it was all about creative people inspired by automotive. So I interviewed people, for example, a woman in Texas in the US who takes old cars and she freehand laser cuts like lace patterns in the body of the car, so the car looks like it's wearing a dress of lace. Incredible. You know, I've interviewed a chap called the Rag and Bone Man, who's based down on the South Coast, and he takes anything from, you know, old motorcycle parts to former engines on RAF, like aeroplanes that fought in the war. He turns them into sculptures, into furniture, into chandeliers, into installations. I went to Amsterdam and I met this woman who worked secretly in the roof of the canal house, and she makes tiny little silver and gold versions of cars that can be worn as jewelry or used as ornaments. You know, so traditionally the journalism has always been about car reviews and the historic story about the inception of that car, or maybe who raced it, who drove it. But I've come at it in a different way, and I'm like, well, what about all the people that make a living or do really cool stuff in a different way, but still associated with that car? You know, most people wouldn't have necessarily associated a classic Beetle with a woman in Amsterdam who makes awesome jewelry, and she uses recycled gold and recycled silver. And that's I've just looked for different stories, and also I, as I say, I write from the heart, and I'm always very honest about my experiences, and there's this kind of idea, if you have a classic car, then you must be someone that wears overalls, gets under the car, tinkers every weekend. That is not me, and that is totally okay. But traditionally it's been like, well, if you don't know how to do it, then you shouldn't own this car. And it's like, well, why? You know, you can learn, and you do learn. If you own an old car, you're inevitably going to learn how it works, because it's going to have a problem at some point. But it doesn't mean to say that you have to be that greasy, spanners on cliche idea of what a classic car owner is. You know, I'm coming in, I'm like, you can have fun with this, you can do really cool stuff. You know, you can, my friend I just got married, and she made this amazing replica of my car in cake with a miniature version of myself and my now husband. You could be someone that makes cakes that look like classic cars. You know, there's so much to it. And it's just looking at it from a different perspective. And I'm really honest about that on social media. I push myself and the way that I use my granddad's car. Like last year, I did 2,000 miles around the UK with my dad as my co-driver. We took it in turns. So we did 2,000 miles in 46 hours and 59 minutes for charity. And for a 64-year-old car, that's incredible, you know. And so it's like, you can do this stuff. You don't have to just take it to the pub on a rainy day. Challenge yourself with this car. And I think that it's kind of shaken things up a bit, because I've not, you know, I've come into it just a very different angle. And the first piece I wrote outside as a freelancer was about failure. It was early 2020, and as we all know, we all got sort of locked down. But in February 2020, my MGA was about to depart for Bangkok, and my dad and I were going to drive around Southeast Asia, 20 days through mainland China, Tibet, Nepal, and then ship home from Calcutta in India. And the first feature I wrote was about prepping the car for that journey, and then the difficult decision to cancel that trip before. This was February, so it was before it kind of kicked off here. I called it Mission Aborted. And so my first piece was about failure and the emotional impact that decision had before the pandemic had really hit, the practical side of preparing the car, and the connection I have to the car and my granddad. And I closed the piece saying that he always used to say to me, "Drive safely, sweetheart." And that was the way that I finished that feature. And it's a different tone, it's a different approach to this like gung-ho or really practical sort of article that people are quite used to.
And it's really, really clear how passionate you are about this. And I think, yeah, it's obvious that you're bringing almost like, I suppose, a feminine perspective, which is much more, like you say, about the people and the feelings rather than, you know, the logistics and the mechanics. And that's great, because that then opens it up to a whole new audience, doesn't it? So I can really see how you've kind of carved out a niche within a niche as well, but through that perspective. I mean, you've mentioned Practical Classics magazine, but could you tell us a bit more about sort of the range of people that you work for? Because I think you mentioned a TV series as well.
Yeah, so I write for both online and print publications. So that ranges from Practical Classics magazine to a publication called Octane, a luxury lifestyle magazine called Tempest, and then online platforms. So I write for a publication called Haggerty, which is US and UK based, but also I write for Country Living magazine, which is quite honestly my favorite gig. I love it. And that's where I think the sort of the niche thing comes into play, because the niche that I've carved is classic cars, but classic cars are also associated with heritage skills. and Country Living look at artisans and the heritage skills that they're preserving. And so, you know, I started writing about classic cars, never imagined I'd be writing about someone who uses a 300-year-old bronze casting technique to preserve the forms of fruits, you know. And so that's where I find it really interesting, is that where that niche can go, but it's the same theme. It's still a heritage skill that artisan is using, to the heritage skill that an apprentice mechanic is using to keep a Jaguar on the road. And so that's what's really been quite fun and quite interesting, and kept things varied. And then, you know, in the past I've always been writer, editor, very much around, you know, hiding behind my words, whereas in, I think, was it, I lose track of time, it was June last year, someone contacted me on Instagram and said, we're doing screen tests to put together a new classic car restoration show. And I thought it was one of those dodgy DMs that you get and you're like, yeah, whatever, I'm gonna ignore that. But it turned out to be very legitimate, and I had a screen test, and I found out at the end of June, I think it was, that I'd landed the role of presenter, and it was very surreal, because I'd never seen myself doing anything, you know, in front of the camera. I think we've all become quite used to communicating on cameras, you know, whether it's Zoom, FaceTime, you know, WhatsApp phone calls, and, you know, with cameras and things. But to actually be a presenter and in front of a camera was a very alien thing. But now I'm freelance and I'm not affiliated with one publication. I am me, and that is so liberating. And I didn't realize how institutionalized I'd become. Don't get me wrong, I had an amazing 10 years, but being free from any one publication or brand is so liberating. So when I went into that screen test, I was nothing but myself. I said, I've never done this before, I've got nothing to lose, and that was really, really cool. And so when I went to do the filming last summer, it was the first day of that mega heat wave we had in July. And so the format of the show is that there were 10 episodes. Each episode features 2 classic cars. The owners bring them to the workshop. My job is to find out what their story is, why they love their car, why it deserves to be restored or brought back to life, and given that next chapter, and sort of try and diagnose what the issue might be. It then goes into the workshop, which is a female-led format. So you've got three women that work there. You've got the trim shop, the body shop, and the mechanic, all female. And then you've got Derek, who has been doing this he's a mechanic, he's been doing this for like a million years. He is, you know, everything you want to know, he knows the answer. And so the show itself is female led, but it also shows how you can, you know, generations can work together. You've got old school and new school, and they can actually come together to do something positive, even when they have different approaches, different personalities. So that's what's one element that's really nice about that show. And as I say, the first day of filming we did was the first day of that heat wave, and I had not sweat tested my new t-shirt, and it did not go down very well. And then I spilled my lunch down it, and it was an absolute baptism of fire in all senses, because it's so hot, and I had to climb on this trailer with this very hot metal car and touch it and pretend that it wasn't really burning my fingers and things like that. So, but it was amazing. It was an amazing summer. And that first week that I was on set, I also got awarded my second award for classic car, first award as the classic car writer of the year, which was really cool. So last summer was massive, and filmed this series that went out on Dave this year, and we don't know if we've got a second one yet. We'll find out hopefully soon. But it blew my mind, you know, from 2020 when I had no job, no work, and my granddad's car, and thought, okay, what can I do with this? How can I do something purposeful and useful? To doing that was like, wow, mind-blowing. And that's what's really cool about being a freelancer, is that you can say yes to stuff, but don't get me wrong, it can be really hard, really isolating. I do struggle with it as well, because no one's got your back, and pricing yourself and all of those things and knowing your rights. I would really struggle with that. I'd not done presenting before, so I didn't know what a day rate should be. I didn't know what your rights are, anything like that. And there are people I've spoken to for advice, but at the end of the day, you still don't know. You never really know. You're like, oh, have I downpriced myself, outpriced? I don't know. But yeah, so quite varied, for sure.
yeah, those kind of things are difficult, isn't it? It's kind of where that's where kind of freelance networks are really important, because to try and get that support from other freelancers. I mean, one thing that Lily and I have always said is just be open to new opportunities. Kind of, I would say the same thing that you did, that when I started freelancing, I was trying to picture what that would look like and who I would work for. And actually, what my career looks like now is completely different to what I'd kind of envisaged at the beginning. I mean, have you found that as you've become known in this world, that you get people coming to you more, or are you still like in that pitching cycle mostly?
Absolutely. It didn't take long to kind of get a bit of a sort of, I guess, a reputation and to get my name out there, because I think because there aren't many female journalists in automotive, and so being in that minority did help. And I think that's an important message, is that, you know, to a point, there is a tick box element to it sometimes, but those boxes have to be ticked initially. It's a starting point, you know, because I'm still here because I'm good at what I do, and that's a really hard thing sometimes to be confident enough to say. But I find now that I still pitch to people, but people are coming to me more than they used to, because they know who I am, what I do. And part of that has just been, you know, through showing what I do on social media, but also just networking. It's, as you'll both know, it's just getting out there, talking to people, and just being really positive and I'm full of ideas and full of beans. So I do get approached more now by editors, particularly for presenting roles and things like that. So I've done some event presenting at festivals and stuff like that, and that's stuff that people come to me for. But then once someone's come to you, you can then go, oh, okay, so they want me to present, so they might want me to present, so I'll approach them. It's like the dominoes, isn't it? You think, oh, okay, maybe I'll try this. And so I then pitch myself to other people. So it's a bit of both, really.
Yeah, and it's interesting there, you sort of talked about putting yourself out there on social media and kind of building those networks, and we've kind of noticed that you're quite active on LinkedIn, and this is something that Emma and I have both kind of struggled to get our head around. Has that been a conscious decision that LinkedIn is the place to be, and that's what you want to concentrate on?
LinkedIn, for me, I see it more as a sort of a concentrated professional network. So it's obviously a social media platform, but the network that I've built on there is more industry led and professional. Whereas something like Instagram, you've got followers who just like you because they like your car, they like what you get up to. And that's not necessarily a professionally linked relationship that you have with that follower. Whereas LinkedIn, I think, is more professional. Although saying that, it's getting a bit hazier. But I tend to make sure that I post my articles and stories and things like that on there now. And I never used to use LinkedIn. I set up an account years ago and it just sat there dormant. And I have to say, I need to sit down and just make it more streamlined. And I need to go through that. You know, you've got your timeline of your career. You know, I noticed that I'm still working at Daily Express, and it's like, no, that was about 15 years ago. So I do need to do my admin on that platform to make sure that it is more sleek and kind of up to date in that respect. But it is good for connecting to people. But I still find it quite baffling, because people say that you shouldn't accept the connections with other people unless you know them, because then it looks like you've just got lots of people that you're connected with and it devalues your profile. Whereas other people say, yeah, but it's a good, because then you've got that connection and you can message them. So I find LinkedIn a very strange beast. Whereas something like Instagram, that's actually where the presenting opportunity came from, because the director had seen what I was up to, and the videos and more my personality, which I suppose lends itself to television. Whereas, you know, on LinkedIn, there's not so much of that facing stuff. It's more about, here's my work, this is what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. I'm sort of the other way around to you, in that my profile is very up to date and kind of sorted, but I never post on there. So, and the one thing that you kind of hear from people who are on there a lot is you've got to keep posting, you've got to keep posting. So it's kind of making that conscious decision, isn't it? To like, this is a place that I'm going to use to try and find work. this has been so interesting, Charlotte. It's been brilliant. It's really nice chatting to you. And before we sign off, we want to get your recommendation of a piece of work by a freelance journalist. Have you got something to point us to?
Yeah, so it's actually one of my former colleagues at the Sunday Times, a woman called Katie Binns. So she specializes in like the nitty-gritty of finances, everything from kind of economic abuse to, you know, how to get a mortgage and things like that. But she did a piece recently about new mothers that are missing out on thousands of pounds of pay due to failings of their employers during maternity leave. So I definitely recommend reading that if you are a mother or hoping to be one. I'm not, but I still found it very interesting, because, you know, as a woman, these issues, you know, affect all of us, and it's just good to get a picture about the bigger picture about, you know, what challenges we face. You know, things like economic abuse, that's increasingly becoming a problem for women, more so than men. And so, you know, Katie does a lot of these reporting. She does workshops, and as a freelancers, you know, I think it's really important, and I'm guilty of it. I'm not on top of that kind of stuff. I haven't sorted out my pension or all those things. So, you know, if I took more notice of what Katie said in her writing, then I'd probably be in a better position. But her stuff is brilliant, really informative and really well explained. And she also loves wild swimming, which I just absolutely have to applaud her for. So she can be found on Twitter. It's at KT_Binns, BINNS. So you can follow her on there. That's where she posts a lot of her stuff. She's also on LinkedIn. So you can find her in both of those places. But she's just incredible, and she's carved a niche for herself and has absolutely rolled with it and is bossing it. You know, she gets asked to do podcasts and things like that all the time. And so, yeah, she's definitely one to follow.
Fantastic. Well, we'll dig out all of those links, and I think that's really useful, particularly maternity leave, because obviously for freelancers it's even more difficult. As for pensions, we did a previous episode called "Sort Out Your Pension," so you should have a listen to that one.
Yeah, I did, but I've still not done it.
Yeah, it's just doing it, isn't it? It's getting it done, ticking it off the list. Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been really, really fascinating. We're going to wrap up now, just to let our listeners know that if you want some more exclusive podcast content, then over on Substack, on our premium version, we do regular bonus podcast episodes.
Yep, and all of our other resources can be found on our website, freelancingforjournalists.com. So go and have a look at that.
Yep, go over, check us out. We've got all our links on there and all our bits and bobs. But we're going to wrap up, so goodbye for now.
Bye for now.
Thank you, bye.